And we're saying it again now by opting out of the proposed settlement because we believe a couple of things. Number one, the DOJ is ill-informed, had preconceived notions, had decided where they wanted to go beforehand, analyzed our MLS and misrepresented what has happened in Northwest MLS. And we don't want to make the practice changes per the settlement, but we already made the changes that we believe the DOJ was after. And we figured this out ahead of time, and we pulled the offer of compensation out of our MLS in 2019. And we changed our rules, and we supported legislation to require contracts with buyers and transparency. As a matter of fact, the DOJ even agreed with us and our position, a couple of years ago. And now the DOJ is hostile, and the DOJ has even been in and investigated our MLS and done what CIDs, huh, John? And then the DOJ went ahead and misrepresented what has taken place in the Seattle area by only investigating one brokerage firm out of 2,300 and then using a DOJ employee to make that investigation. So back to my original premise, what they're saying is, we're not opting into this. We already eliminated offer of compensation. We already require, and through license law, require buyer contracts. We believe transparency is much better than hiding it, that hiding it allows for deceptive practices, for possible discrimination and violations of fair housing laws. And so we're not opting in. Now, to opt in, it would have cost Northwest MLS $3.3 million, $100 per person, per user, times 33,000. And so it's almost like it's not the money, because I'm sure they got $3.3 million, and they already adopted and adapted to the circumstances being pursued by the DOJ, with the exception, they believe sellers and brokers should be allowed, I guess, to make compensation, but they say that their model is already consumer centric. And so the big news is they said, we're not opting into this settlement.
But they have some reasonable
That's pretty
things.
big, huh?
John talked about it this morning on our meeting with Real Tina about how ambiguous the verbiage is in the settlement. And so I kind of think that even though it's pretty brazen at this moment for them to clarify that they've been doing this and that they're not opting in, do you think that's going to start a trend?
No, because they're very unique in that they started this in 2019. They removed there's only a handful of non-realtor MLSs. Most of the MLSs are and continue to be an offer of compensation as a defining characteristic of an MLS. Northwest MLS changed their model so that it wasn't an offer of compensation any longer in 2019, and all of the NAR MLS, follow the NAR handbook, the NAR guidelines they're all offers of compensation. So they all have to change. We know that that's coming. Northwest MLS is saying, we've done the yeoman's work here. We've done good work in pursuing what we believe to be what the DOJ wanted. And so why should we pay $3.3 million to something where we already we believe have a better model than the one being proposed? As a matter of fact, because, as you mentioned, which we've been harping on for months now, since March 15th, that the NAR settlement is very ambiguous, leaves a lot to be desired, doesn't have a definition section. And so you're guessing when you try to apply what you think is required, but you're not sure.
John quoted
so
this morning, readily ascertainable. John, can you comment on that? You said it was specifying the amount. You said, how does it appear for lenders? And then, John, you said readily ascertainable. You took that verbiage out. I just wondered if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, well, it's from the NAR settlement, and it basically it's saying that with the buyer broker agreement, which now has to be written, you need to, in that agreement between negotiations between the buyer and the buyer agent, they have to have a objectively ascertainable commission structure. That's the exact phrase, a objectively ascertainable way of having payment of the fee from the buyer to the buyer agent. And the thing that the Northwest MLS has done, they now have moved to what they call decoupling of the commissions. It's no longer something between the listing broker and the buyer's agent. It's between the seller and the buyer in the purchase agreement. And in fact, right on the top page of the purchase agreement, it refers to seller agrees to pay a portion of the buyer agent fee. It thus converted what for years has been a unilateral, one-sided offer of compensation and turned it into, you don't have that as a contract until the buyer actually agrees to it in the purchase agreement. So it becomes a bilateral negotiated between the seller and the buyer. That's a very consumer-centric approach. And the DOJ has, up until now, one of the things they've done is their sole criteria for decreasing buyer broker commissions has been the focus of it. Now you have negotiations between all of the parties, and I think that's the goal of the DOJ.
So Terry, the point, this is a number of points here. One is the ambiguity of the settlement. And John, there's the perfect example, readily ascertainable. Readily ascertainable is very ambiguous. And so there's a number of things in this settlement that are, your guess is as good as mine, readily ascertainable. And what that means is you had to specify some means to calculate a percentage of a closing price, as an example, and not something as open-ended as whatever the seller's paying, I'll take, right? So readily ascertainable is an open construct. And so and John's right. So the MLS was defined since the mid-90s as a unilateral offer of subagency. Unilateral offer of compensation, used to be subagency. And what that meant was if you join the MLS, then the MLS was basically your contract with all the other members of the MLS, that if on their listing, if you brought in an offer, you would get paid. You didn't have to negotiate that, right? You didn't have to convince anybody. It was unilateral. Everybody in the MLS made an offer. If you brought in an offer, you accepted that. And it was unilateral offer of compensation. And so, and it's interesting because agents, when these cases first hit the street, agents would argue. They would say, well, the seller doesn't pay it anyway. The commission comes from the broker. Right? They remember that? Well, the seller, what do they do? The seller doesn't pay the commission. The broker pays the commission. And the DOJ says, exactly. That's what we don't want. And so what people were using as a defense they were saying, well, the listing agent negotiates with the seller, and then the seller is out of it at that point. And so it's not the seller who pays the commission, it's the broker to broker who pays the commission. And that in fact was the case, still is until August 18th. But that's what the DOJ doesn't want. So Northwest MLS changed that in 2000, before anybody said you have to, they did.
So wasn't it changed from August to October? Or was that just some of the myth
No.
that's been out there? Is it still August 17th?
Yeah, still August.
And so my question is if I'm listening to this and I'm a broker owner, franchise owner, and things are ambiguous and they're going to continue to be challenged and refined, how do I message that both to the client, the consumer, and to agents that are representing them? Well,
NAR used a word at the NAR mid-year meeting, that they said Godspeed. Right.
Yeah,
So
okay.
They did, and they're present, right? Godspeed. No, so this thing is ambiguous. Another example of the ambiguity is this idea about compensation versus concession. So nowhere in the MLS can you state compensation, but you can state concession as long as it's not tied to and exclusively compensation. Well, what is a concession? They give you an example. They say closing costs. That's pretty nebulous, right?
Yeah, because
you can make a volume of things that could be closing costs, so it's not defined. And so we're guessing, and two big MLSs, the number 1 and number 2 MLSs in the country, they, to me, have kind of put blinders on. They've said, well, we'll eliminate the CBB, commission to buyer broker. We'll eliminate that field at some point in the future. But now, not because of the lawsuit, but because we think it's so important. We've researched our records and we've discovered that sellers make concessions on the sale of property. And since it's after the sale, and since it's so valuable, we're going to create a concession field before the closing. And so now we're going to have a concession yes or no box. And then we're going to have where you can fill in how much the seller is willing to pay in concession, and what they're willing to pay a buyer broker is, in the minds of these MLSs, a concession. And so they think they're totally within the settlement to create a new category of payment called a concession from the seller to, and it, if you think about it, kind of fits into what Northwest MLS is doing, but kind of not. Because we know that real estate agents across the country will, first of all, they won't even pay. A lot of them aren't paying a lot of attention to this and won't until the day before it happens. And then they'll be wondering what to do. And they'll see this concession field and they'll say, well, that's where the commission is going to be stated. And they'll start to use the concession field as a substitute for the compensation field. And that's totally not what the plaintiffs want. It's not what the DOJ wants. So we're expecting to hear something about this at some point. And if in fact these MLSs are correct, then good for them for being pioneers. Others will follow.
I can see where concessions would be very convoluted, because concessions could be closing costs, could be credits at closing for carpet. I mean, there's just all kinds of things that's going to be messy.
Well, so yeah, what they're trying to get with the DOJ and what the plaintiffs want is they don't want the MLS. The DOJ wants to go further to offer compensation. No compensation information. It says that. No compensation information, no offer of compensation. Well, if you're going to offer, if the seller wants to offer it as a concession, first of all, in a seller's market, and I don't know what it's like in your market, but it's still pretty much a seller's market where I live, and it's hard to find something to buy. There's multiple offers. What seller is going to make a concession ahead of time in a seller's market? Hey, I want 500,000, but by the way, I'm willing to concede. That's not how it's done. Right.
Isn't that the whole premise that we're looking for when we go to Milan? Because there's no offer of compensation, there's no competition. the seller doesn't get exposed. I mean, how can you say to an industry, you can't talk about how you're going to get paid?
Well, you can say it. The question is, how do you enforce it? And so I think it becomes critical, and this is part of the intent, is that people have to be able to express their, and people say this, but without really giving it a lot of thought in my mind, they have to be able to express what their value proposition really is. And if you're a listing agent, you have to explain without persuading. You have to actually be able to explain how the market works, how people will find out your properties for sale, and what's going to motivate buyer brokers to bring you offers. And you need to be able to disclose that without it being called steering to the seller in such a way that they understand. You have a fiduciary duty to explain to the seller the way the market works and the way you attract people. I mean, it's common sense. You offer them some kind of money or something, trip to Hawaii. John Riley doesn't need that, but you offer them something, right? And then they in turn will bring you something of value. And if you're the seller of property, you need to understand that and know that. And one of the things we see is people saying, well, the seller's now not going to offer any commission because they don't have to. Well, you're right. They never really had to. But everybody had a fiduciary duty to bring their buyers. But at the same time, if you're not going to get paid, how do you work that out if you're representing buyers? So we got to figure that out.
Well,
and so I think part of the load here goes to the listing agent, who needs to incorporate into their presentation the value of a buyer broker. What does a buyer broker really do? Do they
Exactly.
qualify the buyer? Do they get them a loan? Do they do the walkthrough on the property? And I know it's not about listing things that you do, but somehow you've got to impart, if you're a listing agent, that it's not a bad thing. It's okay to offer compensation to somebody who provides a service in helping you sell your property.
Well, in addition, and I want John to comment on steering, because, you know, that's in every real estate course on the planet. And yet in so many areas, they don't really pay attention to it. And so, but my question is, as a listing broker, because that was one of my favorite parts of the business, I can tell a seller that boots on the ground is going to beat any kind of, you know, drone tours or whatever, because that buyer broker has to help that consumer make an informed decision. And they're going to know that more than anything else. So there's lots of value there. How they're going to articulate it without steering, because if I'm saying to you, if you don't want to offer compensation, they may want to sell another property where they know they're going to get paid. That's inherently steering, isn't it, John?
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is in the discussion with the listing broker and the seller, it's really not about how to get the sale. It's about what kind of advice you can give. In other words, you become more of an advisor than a person who is well trained in selling and sales. Because you know, some of the videos that I've seen where the listing broker is basically coming out frequently and saying, you know, if we don't offer close to the standard commission, then but no buyer broker is going to want to show the property. So in other words, it gives a threat, in a sense, to the seller to come up and give closer to what is customary and what is then something that's truly negotiated. And there's a difference between, you know, selling and advising. And I think we'll probably see training programs that I think you mentioned it, Terry, where there's more scripts put together that illustrate the benefits to a seller of working with a buyer broker.
Well, as a master coach,
You know, Johnny,
they're going to change. I'm sorry, Sal. They're going to change as things get defined. But at the end of the day, you've got to know what to say so you don't get in trouble again. You know what I'm saying? You can't say, oh, you better offer compensation because somebody else will sell your property. I mean, when it comes up as a buyer says to you, I can't afford to pay you. There's these, I just don't want to violate another code of ethics article by trying to avoid what the DOJ's just asked us to do. And I don't know, I've not been trained or educated how to answer that. Go ahead, Saul, sorry.
I say, well, part of your fiduciary duty is explaining how the marketplace works. And so we know how the marketplace works. When we were talking about syndication in the old days, we said distribution trumps destination. Distribution. Well, how do you get more distribution? Well, in advertising, the way you get more distribution is you run more ads. Back in the days of the newspaper, you would run display ads. You pay money. It costs you money to get distribution. And so if in fact you want more distribution of the availability of your property, you offer something that people will see of value, and you'll get more distribution. And more distribution will then give you a greater chance of attracting more offers, which might create more competition, which might get you as a seller a better price because you got people competing for that property, as opposed to only one person knows, and then there's no competition there at all. And now you're stuck if you're a seller. So you want broad distribution of the availability of your property. And you know that people aren't going to work for free. So as a concession, you might, as a seller, agree to pay any other broker other than your own, because you pay them separately, pay any other broker who brings you a buyer. And that's where it is a concession, right? And it can legitimately be called a concession. It's not compensation under the old compensation model.
You know, I think where the Northwest MLS came in and they said, you know what the answer is to steering? It is transparency. In other words, the more this is out in the public, instead of where it's secretive, you know, that where it was hidden in the MLS or other ways that brokers will have, is in a sense deceitful. So if we make it more public, then that's going to really lessen this fear of steering.
Well, John, that was also part of what the DOJ wanted a couple of years ago. And the industry made the changes where they said the buyer broker commission should be on these public portals. And the industry didn't argue with that. And the industry made it transparent so consumers could see how much the buyer broker was being compensated. And it was transparent. Now the DOJ and the plaintiffs in this case are coming in and saying, we don't want people to see what the compensation is. We want them to negotiate out of blindness.
Yeah, that's when they withdrew from the initial settlement where it was stated, and that was a striking difference with what the new administration came up with, and thrown a whole new light to it. So rather than focusing just on the NAR settlement, we all need to be aware of and tuned into what is the real attitude of the Department of Justice. And I think we're getting closer to that as a result, some of the pleadings in the MLS PIN case now coming from the DOJ.
Well, John, it'll be interesting to see if the plaintiffs in this settlement come after Northwest MLS, because they're a target now. They basically stood up and said, we ain't buying. We're not going to do it. Come on after us.
And they happen to be located in the area of the law firm, one of the big law firms in the Morrell case. And so they're right in the neighborhood.
Well, I guess my question is, first of all, we have to keep everybody updated. That's why we are the data advocate. And we know that because we have a secret weapon, which is Saul Klein, who's absolutely up to his earlobes into MLS, being with the California Association or San Diego Association, and John not being an attorney. But this is changing like all the time, because somebody will say something just like Northwest MLS, and then that'll cause a response, which will cause another response, which will cause a clarification. So it's almost like whack-a-mole. I'm not sure how we're going to keep up and keep current with between the myth and the real stuff. What would you, besides listening to the data advocate, because we're paying very intentional attention to it, what else can we do? What would you say to a broker owner or manager or a franchise?
Number one, I'd say study what Northwest MLS has done over the past 5 years.
That's a good
Just
point.
kind of look at that, right? And so understand the terminology. And so where MLS was an offer of compensation and it no longer is, you have to figure out ways to do business. And one of the most important things to you in figuring out how to do business is knowing how much you're going to get paid. And so how are you going to figure that out? Well, you've got to use the telephone. You've got to text people. If you're listing a property, you have to use sign writers or flyer or whatever means that social media to indicate, because under this settlement, again, we don't know what the DOJ is going to say, but under this settlement, brokers are still allowed to offer compensation to brokers, and sellers are allowed to offer compensation to buyer brokers. You just can't do it through the MLS, but you could do it through social media. You could do it through your Facebook followings, right? You could do it on LinkedIn.
Right, and how has Northwest been doing it since 2019? I mean, obviously, they're survived doing that.
Well, their listing contract first is very specific about the payment and who pays somebody that represents a buyer. Then their offer to purchase is very specific. Then you must have a contract to work. So they've worked this out. They've worked with the legislature. Do you remember Tom Hurtlebrink?
Sure, great
I know
guy.
John does. Yeah, so Tom was the CEO for many years of Northwest MLS, real progressive thinking in the real estate world. And so they've been working on this. I think John L. Scott was a major player in Northwest MLS. You know, people have been thinking about this for a long time and working this through. It's not a knee-jerk reaction for them. So look at what they've done. Their listing agreement is different, very specific. The offer to purchase starts out talking about the negotiability and knowing again that the compensation's not broker to broker. It's not, what do they call it? Not a broker-centric model. It's a consumer-centric model. It's where the seller offers commission to the buyer broker. It's not the listing broker who offers commission.
So that clearly is a safe place from the DOJ because it's between the seller and the consumer.
Well, we think it is, right? We think it is. The DOJ hasn't come out and made their statement, and because the Northwest MLS is if you read their material, they're very aggressive. I love it. They're very bold. They come out and say the DOJ is misinformed. They're disingenuous.
That's a little, right? That's a lot of chutzpah right there.
They're not telling the truth. They're not telling the truth, and they misrepresented us. Well, so it's
yeah. So in closing, I think we'd like to be able to include with the data advocate where that information came from. So John, maybe you can make sure we get the link to that information. And so in closing, what should we do next?
Well, June 18th is a big day for me. I got to get stuff filed by June 18th. But if I were listing and selling real estate today, if I was listing, I would become as good. You mentioned scripts. I'd get as good as I could possibly get in articulating the value of the agent on the other side of the transaction and why that's important. And for me, it's all about distribution. It's about the more people that know that your property is available, the better chance you're going to attract a variety of offers, and that's going to give you more choice as a seller. And so that's important. And if I'm working with buyers, it's real important, I think, to stress the fiduciary duties and how important it is to have a fiduciary representing you in a transaction. And it's important to understand, if you're on the sell side, that you want somebody representing the buyer because you don't want the liability and you don't want your agent to have the liability of a misinformed or misrepresented buyer. So it's all these traditional pieces we worked with for years. And so, and I've said this for a number of years, the agency disclosure form is the key into unlocking a buyer-broker contract.
You know, and if I were to give advice to a managing broker, I would say do a very thorough review of your current company policy, because there may be some policy things that are going to have to change. And I also would look at reviewing your training programs to update them to this new current thinking, which is going to come very soon.
Well, it's definitely a time for us to clarify and identify the value that's beyond the mechanics of real estate, showing real estate or marketing it. First of all, the market has changed tremendously. Distribution, as you mentioned, so we talked about this 30 years ago, has changed tremendously. So it makes sense to stick with the Data Advocate, because we're going to give you the latest updates. Go to thedataadvocate.com and get all the posts that John Riley and Saul Klein are doing. And Saul, thank you for all the work that you're doing. I know at San Diego, you are up to your earlobes and changes and adaptations and clarifications. It's interesting at this point of our professional lives, we're back at it. And you, of course,
Are
jumped
we
in.
having fun? Are we having fun yet?
Yeah. And John, whoever thought, from the language of real estate, which you wrote, what, 30 years ago? Here
50.
we are again. How many?
50.
Oh, well, excuse me, 50 years. I guess I underestimated our youthfulness. All right. Thank you for joining us at the Data Advocate. I'm Terry Murphy. Join us again for another update with Saul Klein, John Riley, the Data Advocate, keeping you up to date.
Thank you.